I am your host, Nicole Will, and we thank you for joining us as we navigate the world with your aging loved one. We are here to come alongside elders, family members, and the senior living community as we explore the world of aging and elder care with helpful resources, informative interviews, and approachable conversations. We get to do this together, so join us on our journey, and this is the willGather podcast. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are so happy to be able to have Lizette Cloete here with us today. She is the owner of Think Different Dementia, a company that she established to teach people to think differently about dementia. It emphasizes education about dementia, how to care for loved ones with dementia in the home, while also understanding all of those common behaviors. Her goal is to really promote aging in place and allowing people to live the life to the fullest despite dementia. Liz, welcome. Please tell us, you've got such a fun background and all of your varied life experiences. What brought you to where we are today?
Well, my husband and I are originally from South Africa, and we emigrated to the United States in 1993. I was a new grad occupational therapist, and when we moved to the United States, we actually lived in 11 different states in the span of 5 years. In growing up, my father was a diplomat, and we actually, in my formative years, I grew up in New York. So I actually learned to speak English in the States. So a lot of people tell me that I don't have an accent. And then I say I have my own accent because it's not truly American, but it's not South.
Right. Oh, it's fun. I noticed the first time we spoke a few weeks ago and I enjoyed here. I was like, gosh, this is it. I think it's a fun accent. I'm from Minnesota, so I feel like I definitely have that Minnesota. Yeah, you betcha. No. accent
Yes,
that
you
comes
betcha
out.
you have an accent.
Yeah. I do. So that's the commonality, right, that bonds us. we each have a little bit of an accent. So you've really, being in New York and traveling so much, you have had a time to be able to interact with so many different types of people and people groups and cultures. How has that shaped what brought you to creating the company and working as an occupational therapist?
When I was in South Africa before I went to school as an occupational therapist, we actually did a standardized test to show what kind of interests you have. And I was really strong in three things: the psychologies or the psychiatries, the behavioral stuff, crafts, art, and sciences, biology. And occupational therapy was the only degree that combined all three of those. And when I did my training in South Africa, we went all the way, we did very rural kinds of field works. And so I always, when we moved to the United States, I called myself the MacGyver OT because I use what a person has in their house when I'm actually working with them. You know, some people have a lot and some people have absolutely nothing. And the training that we got in South Africa allowed us to actually learn how to be creative and make things on our own. Here in the United States, you can buy things off the shelf. But in South Africa, we actually made a lot of the equipment that we would use. I've seen people adapt in ways that we never would have seen here in the States. And I've been able to take that experience, those experiences, and bring that with me to the patients I see, because poverty is not only in South Africa and other countries. There's a lot of poverty in the States. And I'm able to, go into people's houses and use what they have in their house to try to keep them safe. And then I've also gone all the way to the other extreme, the people that have every piece of equipment that is known to man, and have the ability to pay for 24-hour caregiver services. So my background really has allowed me to be able to transition back and forth between these two worlds. I still full-time, I still work, I have my own company, but I still work full-time in home health, and I go from one to the other extreme, literally on a daily basis.
Yes. And that's the best experience when you have your boots on the ground, you're interacting with your clients every day, and you're able to take that into what you're doing now and really marry the two. And combining we do that. We take what we know, we take our interactions, we take our community and relationships and bring them together to create valuable information and resources for people. One of the things I thought when we had spoke before that really stuck out to me was your ability to share what practical steps we can use to evaluate if families should bring their loved one home. And especially this topic is coming up so much because we are currently facing COVID-19 around the world. This is applicable to, unfortunately, our whole world, and fortunately. And we know that this is a very delicate topic. We have those older adult communities that are on the front lines, and they work so hard to keep our loved ones safe, and they do a really, really good job for the most part. And some families are really faced with making some big decisions, especially right now. They're wondering, do I have my loved one come home with me so I can see them, so I can spend time with them, so I can have more eyes on the care that they're receiving? So that is the big question. Do I bring mom or dad home? And what can you tell us about that?
So to start with, I want to agree with you. Facilities do a tremendously good job of taking care of people for the most part. You know, there are some facilities that nobody should be in. But they are fewer and further between than what one realizes. And if you had asked me this question 6 months ago, I would have had an entirely different answer. COVID has really changed healthcare significantly, and in ways I don't think we really truly understand yet. March, you know, when things in our state started to shut down in March, people were still in facilities, people were going to facilities for rehab. But as this has gone on, and it's now November going into December, and people have not seen their loved ones for 6 months or 7 months or 8 months. I am on multiple different Facebook groups where I read every single day. I have not been able to see my parents, my mom, my dad, my wife since March or February. I cannot go in and see what's going on with them. The only time I can see them, and some people have gotten smart, is I can see them if I take them to the doctor. So they just keep making doctor's appointments so that they can take their loved one out to go to the doctor. I have read and heard about people who are who live in assisted livings, who are willing to actually self-isolate after Thanksgiving and then self-isolate again after Christmas for 2 weeks. And they're being told they cannot. They're not allowed to leave the facility. And so I think this is a very real problem for people now that wasn't there before. I'm actually and it's a very difficult question to answer because every situation is different. So you cannot really have just a global, well, these are the steps that you have to do, because it's going to be different if they're in a nursing home. It's going to be different if they're in an assisted living. It's going to be different if they're in an assisted living that's a memory care unit. And what are why were we in those facilities to begin with? From an experiential perspective, I can tell you that people are in memory care units most frequently because of behaviors and because of bowel and bladder incontinence. People in assisted living people in assisted livings are typically requiring assistance with medication management meal planning, laundry, housekeeping. For the most part, they can take care of themselves. And then people in a nursing home are frequently needing either cognitive assistance, the thinking part, or physical assistance, or both. And oftentimes when a person gets to that nursing home level of care, what's the biggest reason people are there is because of physical assistance. And if you have the right equipment, you can almost do anything. That's the big thing between what a nursing home can do and what people can do at home is oftentimes equipment, and having two people available at the same time. So each person is so unique, but you have to start with the desire, the desire to bring someone home. After that, you can kind of start to work through those processes.
No, and I think it's helpful because it really is individual, and we can't speak to that one person specifically, but I think what it does is it helps give people a way to start thinking about what that would look like, which really touches on, what are some of those questions that a family member should ask themselves before they make this decision. It is, like you said, so individualized, and every family situation is so different, and their ability to provide care varies, and that oversight varies, whether they're working outside the home, their own health considerations. So what questions should that family start to think about before they make a decision like that?
I think you have to start with what your own resources are. And when I mean resources, I'm not necessarily meaning financial resources. I mean things like your own time availability, your own ability for frustration, because it is frustrating, or it can be frustrating at times. Your own relationship in your family. If you and your husband are having marital difficulties and your mother-in-law is coming to live with you, that might not be the best decision. Or your own mother, so you have to start with your own resources. Who is the primary person who's going to be providing the care? Typically, when people are in facilities, they have 24-hour supervision. So it's not like you can bring someone home and then still keep doing your full-time work unless you have a plan in place. I'm not saying you cannot still work, but you have to, if the reason the person is in a facility of any sort is that they need supervision, then who's going to be the person providing the supervision? What kind of background do they have? Can you piece it together? So you've got to start with your own resources. Then you have to look at the person that your loved one, the person that you want to bring home. What level are they at? Is it a physical need? Is it a thinking processes need? Is it just supervision? Are they incontinent? Do they have negative behaviors? How do you feel like you could control those or work through those negative behaviors? So start with yourself, and then look at the person that your loved one that you want to bring home. You have to look at, some people are in a facility private pay, which, if you're in a nursing home private pay, you're looking at between $6,000 to $10,000 a month private pay. You can buy a lot of private duty caregiving services for $6,000 to $10,000 a month. If they're in Medicaid, if they're in a Medicaid facility, if they lose their bed, or if you take them out and it doesn't work at home, can you take them back? You have to know that. You have to have had that conversation with the facility, because oftentimes if you lose, so each person's going to be different. Just because somebody has Medicaid doesn't mean that they couldn't come home. A lot of states actually have, in South Carolina where we are, they have what's called community long-term care, which is a Medicaid program that provides caregiver assistance in the house to keep somebody out of a nursing home. So each state's resources are different. So that's what makes it so individualized, because you literally have to know every single piece of these moving parts in order to know what to recommend to a family member. I can tell you, every person I've ever worked with who have brought people home, they'll tell you it was very difficult, but I don't regret doing it.
Yeah.
If you set it up in the right way. But so your own resources, the person that you're wanting to take care of, and then knowing what your community resources are. You have to know what's available in your own community, because if and some of the pros and cons of this is, you have somebody in a facility, they are significantly more likely or potentially more likely to actually get COVID-19 in the facilities. And facilities shut down now when somebody is sick, which means nobody can come in, nobody can go. You lose that ability to see your person. But what people I don't think always think about is each one of those staff members coming in have families and have places that they go. And they're the ones bringing things into a facility. When you go to a nursing home, if you've been in the hospital, before you can even be admitted to the nursing home, you have to have a COVID test. And if you're COVID positive, you get isolated, you get put in a specific spot, right? Facilities have got a handle on it. The people that are typically getting COVID in a facility these days are getting it from caregivers coming in.
Right.
It's the caregiver bringing it in, because there are people who are asymptomatic. And so they don't know that they're sick, and they give it to somebody who's compromised. Well, when you're at home and you have your loved one at home, and say you have to provide caregiver assistance, typically there are less caregivers, there are less people coming in, and your risk is actually, I think, less. Yes, we're all going to have risk. I mean, anybody who leaves the house is at risk for getting it. But you can mitigate some of the risk of getting COVID in the house by having, more control over who you bring into your environment. So those are just a couple of things to think of.
We just spoke with an elder law attorney. That'll be for our listeners to look for that podcast, because it really touches on more of the legal implications of doing that, which is such good information, and just the other side of it, right? We've got these contracts signed, and how do we compensate financially for that? So for families that are feeling super overwhelmed and they're like, okay, I've got these different things to consider, is there someone or some place that they can go to get help with all of those questions or answers? It's probably varies by state, would be my guess.
Right. Social workers are wonderful resources and can help with those pieces of it. The challenge that you have is that if you want to bring somebody home from a facility, the facility will have a social worker. They can help you with the resources and maybe help problem solve some of those kinds of decisions. Social work is really probably the best place to start. I have even referred people to the hospitals and said, call the hospital, say you want to speak to somebody in social work or case management, and just try to, because every state's different and every town is different with their resources. So if a person can get hooked up with a social worker, they can point them in the right direction for some of that. That is not a bad avenue to start with. There are so many pieces of this that you have to think about. You have to think about the doctor. You have to think about the pharmacy. You have to think about will the doctor see them at home? Can you get them in and out of the car? There are just so many pieces of the puzzle, but as far as I know, there's really not like a centralized place where you can go and say, hey, how do I, bring somebody home? Yeah. I will say that hospice is another resource that is often overlooked, because if somebody is in a facility already under hospice care, and I actually worked with a woman this past about a week and a half ago, similar situation. She was wanting to bring her mom home from mom was required to move from one assisted living to another assisted living. And after the move, within 5 weeks, she'd been in the one place for 5 years, and the change, and she just couldn't, her brain just couldn't manage. And Alzheimer's disease is one of the few diagnoses that you fairly automatically will qualify for hospice services. And she'd been on hospice for a long time in the assisted living.
Right.
It was a memory care unit.
Right.
But when they moved her, she decided I wanted to bring mom home, and I was going to work through it with her. But our mom declined so quickly. She actually passed away at the other assisted living with hospice services within 3 days.
Wow.
And so hospice is another resource, and people are so afraid
Right.
of the word hospice.
Right.
But they don't need to be afraid of the word hospice. If you think about hospice services, we're all going to die. Everybody's going to die. I hate to break it to anybody who thinks they're not going to die, but they're going to die.
Yeah.
So we're all going to die. But what hospice can do is, it's just, if you want to think about it as a different bucket of benefits that you can access. Because you have your Medicare A benefits, right? People know they've got their Med A and they've got their Med B, or they've got their insurance, they've got their home health, they have their skilled nursing. Each one of these are just different buckets of benefits that people have. And the one that's often overlooked is hospice.
Yeah.
Hospice will bring equipment that you need, and they loan it to you for the period of time that you need it. Oftentimes you can get some home health aid assistance in the house. It's not going to be sufficient to provide 24-hour care, but it's enough sometimes to give a break. They help with incontinence supplies. They help with a lot of things that people just don't think about. And so using or researching hospice, especially if it's a person in a facility that is already under hospice care, that means there's extra people coming into the house that can help mitigate some of the cost and some of the care. So hospice is another, resource that we don't use as frequently. And by the time people are willing to hear it, it's oftentimes too late.
Right.
And people can benefit from this for months or even years sometimes.
There can be those ancillary support with hospice, music therapy, massage. I mean, all of the things that are going to provide that care and comfort. And I think families also don't realize that you can essentially be a part of the hospice program for how many months, be discharged, be reapplied and re-signed up for the hospice program many different times. So it's not a situation where if you decide to be a part of that hospice care that you're indefinitely going to be in that and that death is imminent, because that is not really the case. That's the misconception.
Yes. And so people, some people are on hospice because death is pretty imminent, but you would know in those situations that is the case. Typically, but there are a lot of people and people also think that if you're on hospice, that means that nothing can be treated. That is also a misconception. It just means that we're not trying necessarily to make somebody better, but we if they get a UTI, they can still have an antibiotic. If they do feel like they need to go to the hospital, there are ways that can be done. They just rescind hospice and they'll take them to the hospital. So being on hospice is not you're imminently going to necessarily die. It's another resource for people available that people do not use or think about using.
I'm so glad you brought that up. We do not necessarily think of that as our first go-to. So I think that's really important. Shifting gears a little bit, when we do think of bringing someone home, and a lot of our loved ones are struggling with those cognitive impairments, and transition and change can be very hard. So how do we make that transition a little bit easier if we decide to bring that loved one home with us?
That is a wonderful question. The best thing that you can do is understand any person who does have cognitive impairment. We all, you and I included, use our environment to significantly cue us regarding our routine. And we all have a routine. Every single one of us has a daily routine, and routine is our friend, especially when we have cognitive deficits. So the first thing that I would say is we want to know as much about the person's routine as possible. And we want to keep them in as close to the same routine as they were in. But having said that, anytime a person changes from one environment to another and they have cognitive loss, it can take up to 3 to 4 weeks for their brain to catch up. So have an expectation from the beginning that it's not going to be just a day or two and they're going to be fine. Somebody like myself who works in the hospitals or have worked in hospitals and facilities, I've seen it time and time again. People will tell me mom was living alone, she drove, she did everything, and something happened and she's in the hospital, and it's like, whoa, they did not realize how impaired her thinking had become. And the reason you notice it more obviously then is because they're not in their normal routine and environment. So expecting that when somebody goes from one environment to another, that there will be a change is very helpful, because it decreases your own frustration and own, oh gosh, what have I put myself into? You have to give it 3 to 4 weeks for their brain to get used to the new routine. And trying to keep people in a very structured routine, like we do when we have little kids, when we have little people, they do better with a very structured routine, getting up at the same time of the day, eating their meals at the same time of the day, going to bed, taking their showers. Remember when your little people were little and you threw them out of their routine, what happened, right? We had a meltdown. We had a temper tantrum.
Yeah.
So adults with cognitive impairment will do the same thing, but not because they're not doing it on purpose, but that's how they behavior, all behavior, positive behavior, negative behavior, is trying to communicate something, especially when we have people with dementia who cannot tell you anymore. They may have lost the ability to tell you, I'm constipated, I'm tired, I'm overwhelmed, I'm hungry, I'm bored. The behavior that they exhibit, whatever it may be, is usually trying to communicate something. So when we move them from one environment to another and everything's different, and we see these behaviors, it's because they can't tell you, I'm scared, I'm hurting, I need comfort, So knowing and setting it up from the beginning to understand that will make a big difference. The second part that you can really do people can do to set themselves up for success is really critically look at the environment. My house is fairly neat. I don't have a lot of clutter, but a lot of people's houses that I do go into have a lot of clutter. And clutter is not a friend for anybody. It's a trip hazard if it's on the floor. And if you have trouble with your thinking processes, it'll confuse you. So really looking at the environment and making sure that there are clear pathways, that there's enough lighting. Houses are dark, and people like their houses to be dark and dim. When you have dementia or cognitive impairment, you lose depth perception. And so when it's dark, it's hard for you to see, and you can trip and you can fall and you can break a hip. So really critically looking at the environment and trying to decrease all of the extra risks that you have that are just because of the environment. And that also will significantly help in bringing somebody home. So those are two things that I just think off the top of my head can make a tremendous big difference, is understanding that cognitive change from environment will make a cognition worse, And that if we can control the environment, we can.
Like you had said, it's setting that expectation. I think if we can go into that, we know that transition is going to take a little bit of time, and to wait that out, so to speak, in the best calm way, and continue to provide that care and that love and that patience. I think it does take a lot of patience, especially initially. I mean, even as my age and I have a change in something in my home, or even, I remember like when you first get married and now you're like new roommates and you're both adjusting to those different routines and schedules, and having someone else in your space and just providing a little bit of grace in those moments.
Absolutely. Remember when you bring your baby home from the hospital, it's 6 weeks to 3 months before you have a new routine. So even when we bring someone else into our house, we have to expect, even though they're our parent or our, for some people, it may be their spouse that they want to bring back home. There is going to be a period of adjustment. But the other thing that I forgot to mention is that if people do bring someone home, to not forget, other than hospice, if they're not at a hospice point, but not to forget about home health. Bringing in, asking the physician for home health, PT and OT and nursing, even speech therapy, because that can help with looking at the environment. That can help with training people. What are they able to do for themselves, so that we supplement what they need and not take away what they can do. Right. Having those people come in and really working with you in the own environment can be very helpful.
You are an occupational therapist. What would your role be coming into a home for older adults? If you could walk us through, what would your initial assessment look like? What can you offer? What are those benefits that you can offer people?
So I'm going to pick a person that I know has cognitive impairment or dementia, just because I know that those are typically the ones that are a lot on people's minds. And when I go in to see a person for the first time, I'm always looking at their thinking processes. That's part of, it's my passion, it's my love, is working with people with thinking processes problems. So it doesn't take me very long to pick up that somebody may or may not have trouble. But I don't like to do a cognitive assessment on the first time I meet somebody. It is a very sensitive subject. People get highly bent out of shape if the spouse wasn't aware that the other spouse is having trouble and you kind of blindside people, or if the kids weren't aware. So I'm very careful when I work with people the first time. I do a cognitive screening on every single person I meet. Every single person, when I go in to do an evaluation, it's 6 questions. And within 3 to 4 minutes, I know, yes, I need to look closer, or yeah, we're okay, or we're that in between time. Then I look at the environment and I do a comprehensive evaluation of the person's environment. Do they use a walker? Can the walker get in the bathroom? Do we need to adjust the height of the walker? Do we need to adjust the height of the toilet? What equipment do they need in order for them to remain safe in their environment? Do they have a tub or a shower? If they have a tub, can we modify the tub so that they can use it by getting the right equipment? Equipment can make a difference. If you just have the right equipment, you can almost do anything at homes. There are very few houses that you go into. There have been a few that I'm like, I cannot fix what's wrong here. This is just, there's a physical barrier, nothing I can do, like a sink that's in a certain spot. There's a 45-degree angle coming into the bathroom. I can't fix that. You got to break out a wall.
Right.
But other than that, for the most part, if you have a good occupational therapist, they can really look at that environment and the person in that environment. And then you look at their resources regarding who's going to be the primary person taking care of them. And then I work on training them. I will always, if I pick up on a person having cognitive impairment on the screening, I will usually sit there and I'll ask their loved one, were you aware that they were having these problems 50% of the time they are, sometimes they're totally not aware of it at all. And then if they haven't been aware of it, then I start to ask more questions, try to get more information regarding how they are processing information. And then I'll ask them, I'll tell them, I have other tests that I'm able to do. Would you like me to do them with your loved one? Because it'll give you information about how they process information.
Right.
And most of the time people will say yes, they want it. They want the other assessment done. I don't do it that day. I come back and I do it a follow-up day. I have multiple different cognitive assessments that I'm able to do with individuals. And then based off of that, I can get them into, like, you have a mild cognitive impairment or a mild dementia, a moderate dementia, or a severe dementia. And based off of that, then I know how to train a person, how to train the caregiver. You know, when people are at different levels, there is a part of dementia, a certain part of people with dementia can actually still learn information, but they can only learn information that they want to learn. They can't necessarily learn information that I want them to learn.
Right.
So if it's highly valued to them information, they will learn it. So we can use that as a basis. And if they cannot learn information, then my primary role is educating the family and the caregiver. How do we keep this person at their best ability to function? Anybody who has cognitive impairment has retained abilities, and not everybody's retained abilities are the same. Our abilities differ from person to person, just depending on lots of different factors. And so being able to tell people this is what to expect now, and this is kind of what to expect next and what to expect next. So yeah, that's what I do as an occupational therapist, but that's not to say everybody's like me.
I could see it being a lifeline for people that they're put in a situation and they don't know because they don't have the background and the knowledge that you have. And so it gives them the tools and resources to be able to feel equipped to best provide that support in their home. So that is very, very valuable and very, very helpful. So let's say you bring mom or dad home and it isn't a good fit and you're finding that you're not equipped to really care for them. Are they able to return back to their senior living community?
That is going to be a very specific question for each different community and each different payer source. If it's a Medicaid bed, you have to be very sure whether that person will be able to return, because bed availability may be different. So they may have to go back on a waiting list. So those are things you have to know beforehand. If it's somebody who's private pay in a facility, that's a very different thing. Most assisted livings, there are a handful that are Medicaid, but most assisted livings are private pay. So it will mostly be a bed availability type of situation. But those are certainly the questions that you have to ask the facility that they were at. I know that the person that I was working with that was going to take her mother out would not be able to take her back. But I'm working with somebody else right now who is bringing her mom home from a nursing facility. And she did confirm with the nursing facility that if it does not go well, that mom will be able to go back. But they're going to have hoops that they have to jump through, and they'll just have to follow through with whatever those hoops that the facility gives you would require you to do in order to go back. And I'm going to say it, and I'm probably going to end up in trouble for it, but I'm going to say it anyway.
No.
Hospitals, if it really gets to a point where you cannot take care of somebody, you take them to the hospital. And, you then say, because I think I would, and this is a hard question for me to answer, because if there's truly a desire to take someone home, then you're going to do everything in your ability to keep them at home first. And if it truly gets to that point, and I'm not talking about somebody who hasn't really put effort forth, that the behaviors are such, or the burden of care is such that it is not a safe situation, that is what a hospital can help with.
Right.
Then you take them back to the hospital, and you take them to the emergency room and say, I cannot physically take care of this situation at home anymore. It has different repercussions because they may not be admitted to the hospital. They may be in an observation status. There are financial ramifications and things that nobody can foresee, but a hospital cannot send somebody home to an unsafe situation or an unsafe discharge.
Yeah.
And if you stand there and say, I cannot take them home, they cannot send them home.
It typically would be in that crisis situation. And so when you are in crisis and you are not able to adequately, safely care for someone, that would be right in an emergency, what our options are.
I had a patient go home. He had Parkinson's dementia. He had Lewy body dementia. He went home with his significant other. I went to go do an assessment on him on a Saturday, and this was right at the beginning of COVID. And I walked in, and I'm like, I realized that this is not a safe situation at all. She physically could not take care. I physically, and I know what I'm doing, could not take care of him at home. And I finally convinced her to allow me to call EMS, and we had him readmitted to the hospital. And because he physically could not go home, he remained in the hospital until they could find placement for him. So that is the backup option. That's the absolute, the papaya hit the fan. There's nothing else we can do. We've tried everything else. Obviously, you want to try to go back to the facility if you're able to, but a hospital is there and can help in that particular situation. It would be, in my opinion, the same as somebody dropping off a baby, right?
Right.
They're safe havens now to drop off children or babies when you're in that situation, and that is what the hospital is there for, partially.
If we are really tying it back to families, I think we walked through some really practical things to think about. The last piece of the puzzle is any recommendations as families are maybe even broaching a conversation with their senior living community. Any helpful advice? I know hard conversations are hard no matter what, but any insight to that would be helpful.
Having worked in most of these facilities, I think starting with the conversation that it's not because they're unhappy with the care that has been provided thus far will go a long way in smoothing ruffled feathers. And coming to the conversation from the perspective of what's happened with COVID and inaccessibility because of what's happened with COVID and not being able to be with their loved one. I think facilities are going to start to have to be very creative about how they let people be with their loved ones, because this is likely not going to be a short little sprint. I think it's going to be a lot longer than I ever thought it would be at the beginning of this year. And so facilities that are not willing or able to start to figure out how do I keep the people in the facility safe, but at the same time let access to families, is the tremendous heartache and changes that these people are having in especially nursing homes. And they don't understand why their loved ones aren't coming to see them anymore. And they're rapidly changing. People are rapidly changing. And so going to the facility and saying it's not because unless you've been unhappy, then that's another conversation.
Right.
But from the perspective of, I want to honor my parents. I need to see my loved one. I cannot keep on with this for another 3, 4, 6 months, year, however long. How can you help me bring them home? Ask, can you help me? How can you help me? What can you do to help me? Can you help me figure this problem out? And then the therapy department in the facility is also a good resource Like I said, if you have the right equipment, you can take care of anybody at home.
Yeah.
You just have to have the right equipment.
It is. That right equipment keeps people safe, right? Those good body mechanics, whether it's assisting with lifting or safety with bathing, all of those things that we don't think about all the time, but that will also have the caregiver be set up to be able to maintain safe and healthy caregiving, and not so they won't hurt themselves and they won't have that burnout.
Absolutely. And if people bring somebody home, my biggest advice is always set up respite right from the beginning. Don't wait. You have to build it in from the beginning.
Yeah.
Make sure that you have people available. Set a time 1 day a week, 4 hours, 5 hours, whatever, that you can get away and be off duty.
Yeah.
Don't wait until it's too much. And then the other thing is, if you are bringing somebody home, there's actually a hierarchy of need. If you think about being on an airplane and the airplane goes down, right? What did they say to you? Put your own face mask on first and then the oxygen on the kiddo, right? So you want to make sure that you do the following. The household has to function first. After the household, it's the person who takes care of the person who needs help, which is the care provider, not the person who needs help. So the household first, food, shelter, clothing, you've got to make sure that the household is running. Then you take care of yourself as the caregiver, and then you take care of the person needing help. Because if you flip-flop those, it goes to dust pretty quickly. If you put that person as the priority and everything else underneath it, you cannot keep it up for the long run.
That's such good advice.
Because it's that sustaining it. It's that sustaining it over time. You have to be able to think about it as a marathon and not a sprint. You know, if so, you have to build it in from the beginning. It's the same thing you tell, new parents. You have to have a date night, right?
Yeah.
Because your marriage is more important than the baby.
Right. And give yourself some sleep, or try to, if you can, try to do those things where you are caring for yourself. This has been so wonderful. Thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to more insight from you. So thank you so much. Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed our episode, please subscribe and give us 5 stars. In all honesty, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening to our episode.